It was supposed to be a night to remember. A celebration of the school year's end. Teachers and students gathered in a banquet hall, dressed in their best, unaware that the next few moments would change everything. Laughter echoed. Music played. No one noticed the quiet boy slipping away into the night. No one knew what he was about to do. This is the chilling case of Andrew Wurst, the teenager who brought death to a school dance in Pennsylvania. What made him do it? Who was he before that night? And what terrifying secrets did investigators uncover about his mind? What drives a young boy to kill? Stay with me as we dive into the mind of a child murderer. And if you love true crime, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the next story might be even more disturbing. April 24, 1998, was supposed to be a night of celebration for the students of Parker Middle School in Edinburgh, Pennsylvania. It was the annual 8th grade dance, a milestone event marking the transition from middle school to high school. The students had been eagerly anticipating the night, dressed in their finest outfits, ready to dance to the latest music and create memories with their friends. Teachers volunteered to chaperone, ensuring that the kids had fun while staying safe. Parents dropped off their children, confident that it would be a night like any other. The air was filled with excitement and laughter, a typical school dance where everyone expected joy, fun, and innocence. But behind the facade of music and celebration, something far more disturbing was about to unfold. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere was typical of a school dance. Students mingled, some danced awkwardly, while others gathered in groups chatting and laughing. Teachers kept a watchful eye, but everything seemed calm, just another event in the school year. But not for Andrew Wurst. He was a 14-year-old boy, blending into the background, appearing just like any other student, but his mind was far from the joy around him. What could possibly drive a young boy, seemingly just like any other, to pull out a gun and open fire in the middle of a school dance? Was he planning this all along, or did something snap that night? Andrew Wurst was quiet, detached, not engaging with his peers. It was around 9:40 p.m. when he decided to slip away from the dance floor. He stepped outside into the cool night air, away from the music and laughter, his intentions far from innocent. At this point, no one had suspected that Andrew would be capable of the horror he was about to unleash. No one questioned why he had left the dance. After all, it wasn't uncommon for a student to step outside for a moment of solitude. But Andrew wasn't just looking for some fresh air. He had come prepared. Hidden under his clothes was a .25 caliber handgun, a weapon small enough to conceal but deadly enough to change everything in an instant. What was going through his mind at that very moment? Was he scared? Was he nervous? Or was this the culmination of something darker that had been building for far too long? Minutes ticked by as Andrew stood outside, the gun in his hand. Inside, students continued to dance, unaware that danger was lurking just outside the door. At some point, a teacher named John Gillette stepped out. Maybe he had gone outside for a break, maybe he saw Andrew alone and wanted to check on him. No one will ever know for sure. What was going through Gillette's mind as he approached the young boy standing there, perhaps not realizing the danger? Did he notice something unsettling in Andrew's demeanor? Or was he simply doing his duty as a teacher, trying to make sure a student wasn't wandering aimlessly? Then, without warning, Andrew raised the gun and fired. The bullet struck John Gillette in the face. It was an execution-style shot. Gillette, a teacher beloved by students, collapsed in the parking lot. He didn't get a chance to scream. He didn't get a chance to run. Inside the hall, the dance continued. Students were still dancing, laughing, and enjoying what was supposed to be the best night of the year. They had no idea what was unfolding just outside. No one inside had yet heard the gunshots. It wasn't until a few moments later, when the second shot rang out, that the world inside the hall changed forever. Students screamed as they realized what was happening. Chaos broke out. Some students ducked under tables. Others rushed to the exits, scrambling to escape the horror unfolding around them. Teachers, who were supposed to be guardians of their students, now found themselves just as terrified as the kids they were supposed to protect. Andrew wasn't finished yet. With the gun still in his hand, he walked back inside the dance hall. The same hall where just moments before, students had been laughing and dancing. Now it had become his hunting ground. His eyes scanned the room looking for targets, and then the second shot rang out. More screams, more panic. 3 students were hit, and a chaperone was injured while trying to shield others. What would you do if you were a student at that dance? What would you do if suddenly, the celebration you had been looking forward to became a nightmare? Would you run for the exit? Would you hide? Would you fight back? Would you even be able to comprehend what was happening at that moment? The terror lasted only a few minutes, but for the students and teachers involved, It felt like a lifetime. The gunfire finally stopped. Andrew, having fired all the bullets he had, made his way toward the exit, walking calmly as though he had finished what he came to do. Outside, restaurant owner James Strand had heard the commotion from nearby. He saw the panic, the chaos, and then he saw Andrew. Strand, not a law enforcement officer, not a trained professional, made a decision. He couldn't just stand by. Strand confronted Andrew, forcing him to drop his weapon before the police arrived. The nightmare was over. Andrew Wurst was in custody. The students, shaken and terrified, were led to safety. But John Gillette was gone. His life had been stolen in an instant. A beloved teacher, a kind man, killed in the blink of an eye. So, what drove Andrew Wurst to commit such a horrific act? What had happened in his life leading up to this moment? Was there something about his home life, his family, or his mental state that could explain why a 14-year-old would walk into a school dance and open fire? Investigators soon began to unravel disturbing details about Andrew's life. What they uncovered left them and everyone else shocked. His home life, his interests, and the chilling signs he had shown prior to the shooting painted a disturbing picture. But what was the real cause of this tragedy? What happened in Andrew Wurst's mind on that fateful night? And could this tragedy have been prevented? The questions linger, leaving everyone to wonder, how does a young boy, seemingly like any other, come to commit such a horrific crime? And what does it say about the warning signs we might miss in the lives of troubled youth? Andrew Wurst was not the kind of boy most people would expect to commit such a horrifying act. In the aftermath of the shooting, investigators, psychologists, and journalists all sought to answer the same pressing question. Who was Andrew Wurst before that night? What could have pushed a 14-year-old to walk into his own school dance with a loaded gun and open fire? Unlike many school shooters who had well-documented histories of violence, severe bullying, or deep-seated grievances, Andrew did not fit the typical profile. There was no clear history of abuse, no long record of violent outbursts, and no catastrophic life event that could easily explain what led him down such a dark path. On the surface, he was just another quiet, seemingly unremarkable middle schooler. But underneath that ordinary exterior, something had been festering, something that would eventually explode in the most terrifying way possible. Andrew Wurst grew up in Edinburgh, Pennsylvania, a small and quiet town where violent crime was practically unheard of. His family was middle class, neither exceptionally wealthy nor struggling with poverty. There were no reports of extreme dysfunction in his home life. His parents were not abusive or neglectful. To most outsiders, he appeared to have a stable upbringing. But as investigators would later learn, stability does not always mean happiness. Andrew was described by classmates and teachers as quiet, introverted, and often detached from those around him. He was not known for being particularly social, nor was he considered an outcast. He was just there. A kid who blended into the background, never drawing much attention to himself. He wasn't the star athlete, nor was he the straight-A student. He wasn't the class clown or the troublemaker. He was just Andrew, reserved, awkward, and often lost in his own world. But there was something unsettling about the way Andrew carried himself. Some students recalled that he had a dark sense of humor, often making jokes that were disturbing or inappropriate. Others said that he had a fascination with death and violence, though it was never extreme enough to raise serious alarms. Some classmates remembered that he seemed to lack empathy, that he had a blank, almost emotionless stare. But was this just a typical case of teenage angst? Or were these warning signs of something much deeper and more dangerous? His teachers had mixed opinions about him. Some found him to be an average student, though not particularly motivated. Others noticed that he seemed withdrawn, sometimes even disinterested in the world around him. He was the kind of kid who could sit in a room full of people and still seem completely alone. But was he just an introvert, or was there something darker at play? If Andrew didn't come from a broken home, if he wasn't a victim of severe bullying, if he had never been arrested or gotten into serious trouble before, then what went wrong? One of the most chilling aspects of Andrew's personality was his apparent lack of strong emotions. He wasn't known to get particularly angry, nor was he known for being overly joyful. He existed in a kind of emotional limbo, never too high, never too low. Some of his classmates would later say that he seemed almost robotic, as if he was simply going through the motions of life without really feeling anything. Was this just teenage disinterest, or was it something far more troubling? His interactions with others were often awkward and distant. He wasn't aggressive, but he wasn't warm either. He didn't have many close friends, but he wasn't completely alone. He was always somewhere in the middle, hovering between being part of the group and standing just outside of it. Was he just another shy kid, or was this social detachment an early warning sign of something far more dangerous? As investigators dug deeper into Andrew's life, they started to uncover details that, in hindsight, seemed ominous. He had an obsession with guns and violence, but he didn't express it in the typical way. He didn't collect violent video games or have a fascination with military tactics. Instead, he seemed fixated on the idea of death itself. He had once joked about killing someone just to see what it felt like. At the time, it was brushed off as an edgy comment from a moody teenager. But was it a joke, or was it a glimpse into the mind of someone who was already preparing to commit an unthinkable crime? In the weeks leading up to the shooting, Andrew's behavior had changed in subtle but unsettling ways. He became even more detached, even more distant. He spoke less. He smiled less. He seemed as though he was withdrawing from reality itself. But no one knew what was going on inside his mind. No one knew that he was already planning to bring a gun to the school dance. No one knew that he had already decided who his first victim would be. So, if Andrew wasn't a victim of severe trauma or abuse, if he wasn't suffering from extreme bullying, then what caused him to snap? Was it something hidden deep within his mind? Was there an undiagnosed mental illness at play? Or was he simply born different, lacking the same moral compass that stops most people from crossing that final line into violence? What makes a 14-year-old boy decide to become a killer? What was going through Andrew Wurst's mind in the days leading up to the shooting? And most disturbingly, could anyone have stopped him before it was too late? As investigators dug deeper into the mind of Andrew Wurst, they uncovered unsettling truths about the way he saw the world, and more disturbingly, the way he saw himself. This wasn't just a case of a teenager who snapped under pressure or lashed out in a moment of rage. This was something far more complex, a psychological puzzle with missing pieces that left even experts questioning what truly went on inside his mind. Psychologists who later studied his case suggested that Andrew exhibited multiple warning signs long before the night of the shooting. They pointed to his emotional detachment, his lack of empathy, and his apparent inability to separate fantasy from reality. Some argued that he had been suffering from depression, while others believed he may have displayed symptoms of a much darker disorder, one that made him incapable of truly understanding or caring about the suffering of others. The truth, as it turned out, was not so simple. Andrew Wurst wasn't the typical school shooter. He wasn't an outcast tormented by classmates, nor was he a victim of relentless bullying. He came from a middle-class family, a home that, by all accounts, was stable. There were no reports of abuse, no signs of extreme neglect. Yet, despite this, Andrew seemed disconnected from the world around him. Friends and classmates described him as quiet, introverted, and often lost in his own thoughts. He wasn't aggressive, he wasn't violent, at least not outwardly. But there was something about him that always seemed off. Some of his classmates recalled that Andrew had a strange sense of humor, one that was often laced with disturbing jokes about violence. At the time, no one thought much of it. Teenage boys often joke about dark things, it's a phase many go through. But in hindsight, some began to wonder if those jokes were something more than just words. Could they have been glimpses into his real thoughts? Warnings of what was to come? What stood out most to investigators and psychologists alike was Andrew's complete lack of emotion after the shooting. In the immediate aftermath, as students screamed, as chaos unfolded around him, Andrew remained eerily calm. Witnesses said he didn't seem shocked or even shaken by what he had done. He was almost indifferent, emotionless. A forensic psychologist who later analyzed his behavior suggested that this lack of empathy was a critical clue. Andrew didn't react the way one might expect, not with fear, not with regret. Instead, he appeared cold, disconnected, as if the suffering of others simply didn't register to him. Was this the sign of a deeper psychological disorder? Or was it something else entirely? Perhaps even more disturbing was what Andrew had reportedly told his classmates before the shooting. He had mentioned wanting to do something big. He had made comments about how he thought he would become famous. Investigators would later suggest that Andrew may have suffered from narcissistic delusions, an inflated sense of self-importance that led him to believe that his actions would make him legendary. But what kind of 14-year-old believes that murdering his teacher and terrifying his classmates will lead to admiration? What made him think that this was the path to notoriety? And then there was his own chilling admission. He never expected to actually kill anyone. That statement alone sent shivers down the spines of those trying to make sense of his crime. Did he mean it? Was this his way of distancing himself from the horror of what he had done? Or was it proof that Andrew Wurst lived in a reality completely different from everyone else's? One where violence wasn't real, where it was just another game, another story, another fantasy? Forensic psychologists report. Andrew Wurst's case is unique. He didn't fit the profile of the typical school shooter. He wasn't the victim of bullying, he wasn't filled with rage toward his classmates. Instead, what we saw was a teenager who seemed emotionally removed from everything around him. He had an unnatural calmness after the shooting, a disturbing indifference that suggested he might not have fully processed what he had done. Or worse, maybe he had and he simply didn't care. So what do you think? Was Andrew Wurst suffering from a severe mental illness, one that robbed him of his ability to feel emotions the way the rest of us do? Or was this something else, something far darker? Could it be that he knew exactly what he was doing and simply didn't care? And if so, what does that say about the way we understand the mind of a killer? The more experts studied Andrew Wurst, the more questions they had. If his mind had been unraveling for so long, why did no one see it? Was there anything that could have been done to stop him before that night? Or was he always destined to become what he did? The mind is a fragile thing, and in some cases, a dangerous one. But where does the line between mental illness and pure malevolence begin? And more importantly, where does it end? The arrest was the beginning of what would become a lengthy and contentious legal battle. Initially, Andrew was charged as a juvenile, a move that seemed to align with his age, 14 years old, just a child by legal standards. However, as the case progressed, questions arose about whether this crime was one that could be appropriately handled in juvenile court. His actions had been so severe, so deliberate, that it wasn't long before the decision was made to transfer the case to adult court. This shift in legal proceedings raised an important question. Should a 14-year-old be held accountable for murder as an adult? Could Andrew, at such a young age, fully understand the consequences of his actions? The trial itself was a tense and highly publicized affair. Courtroom sketches and photographs would later capture Andrew's quiet demeanor, his unreadable face as he sat in front of the judge, surrounded by the weight of the accusations against him. The world watched as the case unfolded, as the prosecution painted Andrew as a cold, calculating killer, and his defense team argued that he was a troubled teenager who had been failed by the system. At the heart of the trial was a crucial decision. Would Andrew Wurst be sent to prison for life, or could he somehow be rehabilitated? In the end, Andrew Wurst pled guilty to the murder of John Gillette and several other charges. His guilty plea came as a shock to many. It meant that he would avoid the death penalty, but it also left some wondering if this was his way of avoiding a trial, of not having to face the full extent of his crime. Was he simply trying to make things easier for himself, or did the plea deal reflect a true understanding of his guilt? After his guilty plea, the sentencing phase of the trial began. Andrew was sentenced to 30 to 60 years in prison, a lengthy sentence but one that left many people wondering, was it enough? Could a 14-year-old be truly punished in a way that fit the crime? Was justice served, or did the punishment not fully reflect the horror of the act? The trial left behind lingering questions about how we treat young offenders, especially those who commit heinous crimes. Was Andrew Wurst just a troubled child who could have been rehabilitated? Or was he a dangerous individual who, despite his youth, should have been held accountable as an adult? The decision to charge him as an adult, and the subsequent sentencing, opened a larger conversation about the justice system, morality, and the limits of empathy in the face of such brutality. Do you think the punishment was enough for Andrew Wurst? Was 30 to 60 years in prison truly a fitting sentence for the murder of a beloved teacher, or was it too lenient? Should a 14-year-old ever be treated as an adult for such a crime, or is it wrong to hold children to the same standards as adults? Where do we draw the line between justice and mercy, and who decides who deserves to be held accountable for their actions? The case of Andrew Wurst raised more than just legal questions. It challenged society to reconsider its approach to juvenile justice. Was he a lost child who made an unthinkable mistake, or was he a killer who, at 14, had already crossed an irreversible line? The answers remain elusive, and the conversation continues to this day. In the wake of Andrew Wurst's shocking crime, the nation was forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. Schools, the places meant to nurture and educate, could become sites of unimaginable violence. The tragedy at Parker Middle School wasn't the first school shooting in American history, but it was yet another reminder that young people were capable of carrying out acts of brutality that once seemed unthinkable. The case ignited a firestorm of discussions across the country, leading to sweeping changes in school security policies, mental health awareness, and debates about gun access for minors. In the years following the shooting, schools across the United States began implementing stricter security measures. More metal detectors were installed at school entrances, surveillance cameras became a common fixture in hallways, and locked doors became the norm rather than the exception. The idea of open campuses, once considered a sign of trust and freedom, started to fade as schools prioritized safety over accessibility. Security officers were stationed in schools where they had never been needed before, and some institutions even introduced random locker checks and ID badge requirements. These measures were designed to prevent another tragedy, but they also changed the very fabric of school life. Did these precautions make students feel safer, or did they serve as a constant reminder of the lurking threat of violence? Beyond physical security, the case also led to a shift in how schools approach student mental health. Educators, psychologists, and policymakers began to recognize the importance of early intervention when it came to troubled youth. In Andrew Wurst's case, some classmates and teachers had noticed his odd behavior before the shooting, but at the time, there weren't many systems in place to address such warning signs. After his crime, schools started paying closer attention to students who exhibited signs of depression, isolation, or violent tendencies. Counseling services were expanded, peer intervention programs were created, and teachers were trained to identify potential warning signs. But was it enough? Could increased awareness truly prevent future tragedies, or were schools merely reacting to the past instead of preparing for the future? Perhaps the most heated debate that emerged from this case, and others like it, was about gun access for minors. How did a 14-year-old boy get his hands on a deadly weapon? Should parents be held accountable if their children use their firearms to commit violent acts? In some states, the conversation led to tighter gun storage laws, requiring parents to secure their weapons away from their children. In others, it fueled discussions about whether young people should have access to firearms at all. But despite these conversations, mass shootings, particularly those involving young perpetrators, continued to occur. Had the country learned anything from the worst case, or were these debates just cyclical responses to tragedy? The impact of the Parker Middle School shooting was undeniable, and the changes it set in motion were felt nationwide. Schools became more cautious, parents more fearful, and students more aware of the reality that violence could strike at any time. But more than 2 decades later, one question remains. Do you think schools are safer today than they were in the late 90s? Have the security measures, mental health programs, and policy changes made a difference, or has school violence only escalated despite these efforts? And most importantly, are we any closer to preventing the next tragedy, or are we simply waiting for history to repeat itself? If you found this case disturbing and want more true crime content, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Next week we'll dive into the shocking case of a serial killer who left cryptic messages before each murder. You won't want to miss it.